Hello, viewers. Today we will be discussing the topic environment protection and free trade. Are they mutually exclusive? World trade expansion has brought in several important questions revolving around whether there is any relationship between trade and environment. Are they mutually exclusive in the sense that growth and expansion of trade has just no impact on environment, whether national, regional, or global? In this lecture, we'll basically try to analyze and put across various perspectives on this debate whether there is any relationship at all between environment and trade. Now, this question of the relationship between the two automatically does not have any yes or no answer. We cannot say, yes, there is definitely a relationship, or no, there isn't any relationship between the two. But we need to understand that there was a starting point for this debate on the relationship between environment and trade. In the 1990s, the Mexican government challenged a US law banning the imports of tuna from Mexico. The domestic law, which is popularly called the United States Marine Mammal Protection Act, prohibited tuna fishing methods that killed large number of dolphins and banned tuna imports from countries that used such fishing methods. The Mexican government argued that this particular US domestic legislation was in violation of the rules of the GATT. How can a domestic legislation prevent import of tuna which falls outside the purview of domestic legislation? This is not all. According to the free trade principles that provided the basis for GATT and later on World Trade Organization, countries cannot restrict import except in very limited cases such as protection of health, environment, and safety of its own citizens. A GATT dispute panel ruled that the United States could not use domestic legislation to protect dolphins outside its territorial limits. The basic argument was that a domestic law would have its impact within the territorial confines of that country and cannot have impact on trade legislations made by another country in the name of environment protection. Although Mexico did not press for the enforcement of this decision, the tuna dolphin decision opened a major controversy over issues of trade and environment. One more case deserves mention. In 1999, the World Trade Organization ruled that United States of America could not prohibit shrimp imports from countries using fishing methods that endangered the lives of sea turtles. The implications of this particular dispute, which I refer to as the tuna, dolphin, and the shrimp dispute, decision could affect many international environmental issues. How can environmental legislations prohibit trade agreements between countries? Is it violative of the rules of World Trade Organization, which brings about major rules in terms of world trade expansion? Now, please note that this questions of environmental protection and domestic legislations to safeguard environment definitely has impact on international trade across countries and regions. Now, one more thing deserves mention herein when we are focusing on environment and free trade. With the impact of global warming and climate change affecting countries, environmental concerns have been brought in on various trade agendas. In fact, negotiating environmental regulations multilaterally is extremely problematic because of differences in preferences and income level among countries. We also need to understand that environmental regulations and trade regulations varies between one country to another country depending on the level of development of that country. What's more scientific and more evident is that research and scientific evidence is not always conclusive on the impact of certain types of environmental degradation and its impact on trade. Environmental considerations definitely play a role in protectionist trade regimes that are being sponsored by some countries now. Therefore, we need to understand what is the exact relationship between environmental policy and international trade, keeping in mind the World Trade Organization legislations, at the same time the various protocols and conventions which have been implemented from time to time by the environmental regulatory international agencies. Over the past few decades, trade environment debate has revolved around claims that trade, rather increasing trade, undermines environment quality through scale effects and counterclaims that free trade enables countries to come out of environmental degradation. The simple rule is that some advocates believe that we need trade in order to balance the deteriorating impact of environment on countries. Now, we also need to understand that environmental prosperity is equally needed in order to understand that countries need adequate revenue to create a prosperous population. And when countries are prosperous, they can use that revenue in order to bring about better environment-friendly regulations and technology. How much free trade will affect the environment? This is the moot question. What is the range of trade that can be allowed, balancing environmental considerations? Now, usually, activists and international scholars have put in 4 main hypotheses in order to determine the relationship between how much trade can balance environmental considerations. Now, the 4 main hypotheses are the scale effect, competition effect, locational effect, and regulationary effect. Let us start with the scale effect. Now, it has been conceived by scholars of international political economy that as free trade expands, total economic activity also expands. More the economic activity, greater the pressure on the environment, and that would have cascading impact on the lives of citizens as well as countries. It is also important to understand that the scale effects are being offset, or what we call it decoupled, from total increases in different kinds of pollution. So even if we are increasing trade, increasing growth, that is somehow being offset by environmental degradation. This is one moot point that we have to keep in mind when we try to analyze the relationship between trade as well as environment. One indicator of this is the delinking in the decrease in energy intensity per unit of gross domestic product in most industrialized countries. Thus, it can be observed that the scale effects are offset partially by advantages in technology as well as by compositional effects. Moreover, as trade liberalization prompts reallocation of resources through specialization as well as scale economies, the concentration of economic activities places more pressure on the environment. Let us now try to focus on the second important hypothesis, the competition impact. As free trade increases, the contestability of markets exposed to international competition also increases. Pressure increases on the companies to have more profit, more revenues, but then at the cost of what? This competitiveness is actually transmitted by the private sector to the various governments, national, regional, global, who move to relax the monitoring and enforcement of environmental regulations to keep companies at home. The simple logic is that if companies have to gain more revenue, that will have an impact on the air quality or industrial pollutants index at home. And if we have more pollution or environment enforcement strictures, that will not be good for the companies to sustain. Therefore, there is a kind of cost cutting when it comes to environmental regulations. As competition increases, there is a laxity in the enforcement of environmental regulations at the domestic level, causing a deterioration in the overall environmental standards and quality of living of the population at large. And this is not just in developed industrialized countries, but also developing countries around the world. Third is locational impact. If domestic governments maintain strict environmental regulations in the face of increased market competition, companies responding to capital mobility opportunities will exit countries with high environmental standards. So what we find is that countries will move out, or rather companies will move out from countries with very strict environmental enforcements to areas or regions which have kind of lenient environmental regulations. This can be explained with the help of the pollution haven hypothesis. There are some countries which have very lenient pollution rules, and wherein these international multinational companies go, open their industries, and they enjoy various forms of tax concessions. But remember, at the cost of harming the environment of the country where they have been investing. Coming next to the fourth hypothesis, that is the regulatory effect. Even if governments are not swayed by competitive concerns or the need to enhance domestic environmental regulations, these regulations run afoul with trade laws. To give you an example, prior to the adoption of NAFTA or WTO, many argued that hard-fought regulations governing, say, environment, human safety, food safety, wildlife would definitely clash with trade rules, with the latter dumping it on the former. Areas of special concern included the NAFTA on technical barriers to trade and sanitary and phytosanitary measures on domestic environmental provisions. Thus, what we find, more regulatory measures to cover environmental degradation would definitely have a cascading impact on trade and international growth in terms of economic development. Next, we move on to the most important question: is there any relationship between trade, growth, and environment? More trade definitely has a positive impact on growth. Now, more growth, does it impact the environment in a positive or a negative way? While proponents of free trade have long argued that it is an important engine to economic growth, and they say that there is little direct causal relationship between free trade and economic growth. Instead, the empirical literature suggests a surprisingly weak, direct, linear relationship between trade and growth. Instead, an extensive body of literature infers a link, although the changing channels are indirect, dynamic, and generally complex. But we have to keep in mind that there is a correlation between free trade and economic growth, in the sense that countries which have open economic policies maintain more growth than countries which have closed economic policies. Thus, we can see open economies register faster growth. The next part of the discussion centers around, is free trade impacting our environment? Is it changing the environmental norms? What is the experience of developed and developing countries around the world? The first idea, or the first important area that we need to understand, that if we are trying to analyze the relationship between trade and environment, we need to think of policy integration, because environment today is not just national environment. A climatic change in one region has an impact on climatic changes in other countries of the world. And that can be seen in terms of climate change, international conferences, carbon footprints, and so on, regulatory institutions that have come upon. Let us try to understand how policy integration brings about changes in the relationship. The integration of environment and trade policies in the world remains weak so far. Although there are isolated cases where we find that countries have adopted a trade and environment consideration in their economic policies, which means that some countries adopt trade policies and environmental policies in tandem to ensure that more trade does not hamper environment. These include the environmental benefits of removing subsidies and trade distorting measures in specific sectors, notably the fisheries sector. However, instances of win-win, say trade, environment, policy linkages almost invariably involve, we need to calculate the post facto environment benefits arising from established trade norms. The simple logic is that if we are adopting environment-friendly trade measures, is it going to impact growth or not? For the most important part, most of the countries' empirical literature points to the fact that till now there is a very weak connectivity between policy, rather trade policy, and environment. We need to understand the fact that even today, trade and environment takes isolated, linear policy reforms and measures. Now, why do we need to have a policy integration of trade and environment? The logic is that as long as environmental considerations remain outside of or external to economic priorities, serving as little more as policy appendage or afterthought to core economic decisions, we would just be moving from one ecological problem to another ecological problem. Therefore, the need of the time is to entwine trade policy regulations with environment policy regulations simultaneously. Next important aspect, does trade advocacy groups take into account environmental NGOs? The question is there any transparency, openness, public responsiveness so far as environment and trade regulations are concerned? We need to understand that there is a lot of backlash from environmental NGOs towards trade regulatory bodies when they say that whenever there is a trade regulation created, environmental groups are not consulted. In other words, trade regulations do not keep in mind environment protection measures. We need to understand that whenever there is an environment advocacy group or regulation taking place, various stakeholders are taken into consideration before an environmental policy is formulated and applied. But the same does not hold true when we frame a trade regulatory regime. A recurring theme of the public grievance against free trade and globalization agenda revolves around the question of transparency. Why does the public not know about trade regulatory regimes and policy measures which affect the environment? Because environment is one policy measure which affects one and all. We also need to understand that when we are thinking of economic interest, we cannot ignore environmental interest also. One barometer of the public's confidence in economic policies is the extent to which policies shape in a transparent and democratic environment. Involving the public in environmental reviews or assessments of trade is vital. So, whenever there is a trade policy being evaluated and re-evaluated, the public opinion is important. And that is what is needed in order to have a transparent trade policy regime which takes into account environmental considerations too. So, if the public opinion is transparent on both trade and environment, we will see a positive relationship between free trade and environment. Let us now move on to a very important area of discussion, and that is trade and domestic policy. Trade can impact both domestic as well as international policy. This goes without saying. But we also need to understand that whenever there is an international environmental policy or international trade policy coming up, there is somehow a loss of autonomy of the national governments. For instance, whenever we have climate change international conferences or WTO conferences, we need to understand that national autonomy somewhere gets sacrificed at the altar of international regulatory regimes. Concerns have arisen of a race to the bottom in which nations' environmental and social standards are reduced in order to gain competitive advantage. What is meant by this race to the bottom is the fact that countries are ready to sacrifice their environmental regulations in order to invite more foreign direct investment without realizing the negative impact of this FDP on environment in the long run. Now we need to understand how theorists have tried to bring in the relationship between trade and environment. We will start with the theory of comparative advantage. According to the theory of comparative advantage, trade causes countries to become more efficient in the use of resources, thereby conserving resources and avoiding waste. Trade liberalization may also lead to removal of various forms of distortions, subsidies, pricing policies, thus leading to more and more efficiency in resource distribution. For example, widespread subsidies on chemical fertilizers and pesticides promote environmentally harmful agricultural methods, but such subsidies to domestic producers are generally prohibited in trade agreements. Eliminating these subsidies will promote both economic efficiency and environmental subsidies. Thus, we can say concessions in trade or removal of subsidies can have an impact on environmental sustainability with more friendly and farming methods being inculcated in domestic countries. Trade may also encourage the spread of environment-friendly mechanisms. In energy production, for example, many developing countries are heavily dependent on old, inefficient, highly polluting power plants. Now, if you have more trade, more growth, more investment, these old polluting technologies can be replaced by modern anti-pollution technologies. So, investing in anti-pollution technologies requires trade and growth. And thus we can see there is a correlation between growth and environment protection. Now, we can try to explain this environment-trade correlation with the help of the Kuznets curve debate. Now, what does this debate focus on? Defenders of free trade have always relied on the Kuznets curve debate, which asserts that environmental damage increases in the early stages of growth, but diminishes once nations reach higher levels of income. According to this theory, after passing through a dirty stage of development, nations will put up cleaning methods, what we say cleaning up, and will shift to less polluting production methods. Thus, the Kuznets curves provide a general understanding that more open trade may initially increase pollution levels, but then in the long run, pollution will come down through increase of environment efficient technology. Now, what institutions and policies can be effective in balancing the growth of trade benefit and environment protection? Let us try to understand those policy measures. We'll try to understand this positive correlation with the two with the help of the World Trade Organization approach, the European Union approach, and the NAFTA approach. Let us start with the WTO approach. According to this approach, it says that the purpose of trade is liberalized free trade after the creation of WTO. Now, the WTO membership today has reached 120 countries, and they have worked on lower tariff or non-tariff barriers to trade, as well as to eliminate subsidies in terms of export industries. Although the WTO recognizes special exception to trade rules under Article 20 for resource conservation and environmental protection, its panel rulings had interpreted it rather very narrowly. WTO authorities tend to be very suspicious of what they call green protectionism, which is actually the use of trade barriers to protect domestic industry from competition under the guise of environmental regulation. This is not done according to WTO regulations. From the WTO perspective, the responsibility for environmental policy should remain at the national level. As far as possible, the decisions on international trade policy should not be complicated with environmental issues. This is consistent with an environment and economic rule, what we call the specificity rule. Policy solutions should be targeted directly at the source of the problem. So we cannot tag environmental problems with trade solutions. And using trade measures to accomplish environment policy goal is therefore a second best solution according to a WTO approach. Let us move on to the second approach, what we call the NAFTA approach or the North American Free Trade approach. In 1993, United States of America, Canada and Mexico signed the NAFTA agreement, which led to lowering of trade barriers across the continent. During the negotiations for this agreement, environmental groups argued strongly that freer trade would lead to negative environmental consequences, pointing to several severe environmental problems already affecting the tariff-free industrial zones of US, Mexico and Canada. As a result, a side agreement was also passed, which was called the North American Agreement for Environmental Cooperation. Now they set up a tripartite commission on environmental cooperation. With another side agreement, the North American Agreement on Labor Cooperation was also signed. So what did NAFTA did? NAFTA initially created a free trade barrier, but at the same time tried to bring in a kind of an environmental protection commission to act as a linkage with trade. While this unusual aspect of NAFTA persuaded some environmental groups to support the agreement, but in the end it was found out that this Commission on Environment Protection had very few powers. Another important area to focus on is the fact that NAFTA also had an important area on industrial pollution. Mexican environmental enforcement has improved but increased industrial concentration, and herein we find NAFTA focusing more on industrial policies than on environmental protection. Let us move on to the third approach to balance environment and trade, what we call the European Union approach. The European Union approach focuses on what is called harmonization approach. This harmonization is called harmonizing up and harmonizing down. Regional trade policies believe that countries should tighten their environmental policies. Now we all know that European Union is a supranational organization, and its regulation bind all the countries which are part of the European Union. Some countries may be forced to tighten their environmental regulations to meet EU standards. But other countries may find their environmental standards weakened. So when EU is creating a supranational environment enforcement network, it may work for some, it may not work for others. Countries which have a weak environmental standard may find stronger environmental protection measures thrust upon them. But it may so happen that there are some countries which already have a very strong environment protection network. In such cases, the European Union Environment Protection Framework may weaken their already strong environment protection system. Thus, it can have a two-way impact, some countries being benefited and some countries being harmed because of the imposition of this supranatural environment protection network. Let us now come to how multilateral environmental agreements work. Numerous international treaties has been signed from time to time which try to focus on how international trade may not have a cumbersome impact on environment protection. Some of these are the Montreal Protocol on Substances that Deplete the Ozone Layer, passed in 1987, the Basel Convention on Hazardous Wastes, ratified in 1989, the Antarctica Treaty, the Convention on Straddling and Highly Migrating Fish Stocks, and the Kyoto Protocol on Climate Change, which established guidelines for greenhouse gas emissions, including important trade-related measures. Now, what are the strategies for sustainable trade if we have to ensure environment-friendly measures? The emerging 21st century global economy will be characterized both by resource and environment limits by a much more important role that would be played by the present developing nations of the world. Expanded global trade will bring benefits in terms of increasing efficiency, technology transfer, import of sustainable technology, at the same time ensuring that our trade should have a beneficial impact on society as well as environment. Now, we also need to understand that the World Bank have provided a number of guidelines so far as sustainable trade is concerned. It believes that more open trade improves growth and economic welfare, therefore, open trade should be promoted. Increased trade and growth without appropriate environment policies may have unwanted effects on the environment. This should be kept in mind. This implies that future trade policies and agreements must take into account environmental considerations without ignoring the fact that sustainable trade policies should be the future goal of all countries around the world. What can we deduce from today's discussion? Trade expansion can definitely have environmental implications. Secondly, trade may increase environmental externalities at the national, regional, and global level. Thirdly, while it is usually economically advantageous for countries to pursue their comparative advantage through trade, environment impact such as increased pollution, natural resource degradation may also occur as a result of trade. Therefore, the need of the hour is to carry out sustainable trade policies to ensure that trade takes place at a particular level without causing any form of negative damage or impact of environment. We need trade, we need expansion of trade, but definitely not at the cost of environment. That's all for today. Thank you.